Hello guys, welcome back. David here. I hope you're doing well. Even if you're not doing well, I hope you're doing, or I'm actually pretty sure you're doing better than me. I had my stag party, some of you might call it a bucks party, last weekend, and I'm suffering a little bit for it today, but I still have a brilliant podcast for you. Don't worry, I don't sound like this in the podcast just today. So today I have Matt McInnes Watson. Matt is a performance coach and specialist in track and field, speed, power and plyometrics. He has a master's degree in athletic development and he's currently studying for a PhD in plyometrics. Matt is the owner of a coaching business called PLUSPLYOS and he provides plyometric programs to athletes and coaches all over the world. We had an absolute brilliant discussion today all about plyometrics. He's probably one of the few people that I've seen around the world who talks about plyometrics that actually sees it through, looks at it the way I actually look at these things. That doesn't mean I'm right or wrong, it's just how I look at it. So I'm not interested in just pure like force, how fast can you get off the ground, and just progressing people through levels as quickly as they can. So you start with extensive, you end up with intensive, and you're just doing drop jumps or depth jumps or whatever the hell you want to call them. Matt looks at things a little bit differently as well, I think, which is like a full spectrum of movements that you might keep in throughout the year and sprinkle them in, and there's deeper joint ranges, and we're talking a little bit more maybe about fluidity and kind of how the body organizes itself and not just force all the time. So that was really cool for me to actually come across someone like that. Matt helped me understand plyometrics, how he classifies them, how he defines them, the tiers that he uses. We spoke a lot about what's happening in an athlete's body when they're in the air, when they're preparing for the collision. So there's a lot of people that talk about terms like co-activation, co-contractions, pre-activation, pre-tension, things like this, but they don't really probably know what they're actually saying. So we kind of dug into that a little bit. We dug into shin issues and Achilles issues and what might be happening with the foot contact here, how you might reintroduce plyometrics to an injured athlete. And we got very practical towards the end of the podcast. So like, how would you actually write a program? How many movements would you put in the program? What type of movements are they? How many contacts would you be looking for? This type of thing. So we got very, very practical as we went on. I think it's a brilliant podcast. I can't wait for you to hear it. With regards to the stag party, it went pretty well. We, I think about 17 or 18 of my closest friends, we got on an old rickety bus, a very old rickety bus, and we went to Ennis in County Clare, which is about 3 hours away from us. We stopped on the way and went go-karting in Limerick in an indoor track. It was actually very, very good. A couple of lads were like old grannies driving around, but most of us, they were very impressed with the quality of the Grand Prix, so most of us did pretty well. I came third. I took the bronze medal home. I think I did okay. My kart was possibly sabotaged. wasn't as good as some of the other karts on the track, I think. The guy in second, Weens, he took second place. He beat me by 0.1 of a second. On another day, I think I should have probably got silver. I think I could have got second. I couldn't have got first. Tony, my brother, was way out ahead of all the rest of us. He almost got on his first time ever at that track, and he almost got on the top 10 fastest times ever set at that track, which is all set by people who go to the same track again and again and again. And so the guys were very impressed with him. He was miles out ahead, so I definitely couldn't have taken pole, but second was definitely in my grasp. After that, we just went drinking for the full weekend pretty much, and now here's me today. So I have no Instagram posts to do today. I have no podcast to record. I'm going to send a few emails and hit the couch after this, but that was me. These things have to be done, and my voice goes every time I go drinking. So I know I cannot have clients the following day. Tomorrow I have a couple, and then I think I'll be in flying form again by Wednesday. So here's the podcast with Matt. I think you're really going to enjoy it, and please give it a share and a like and a subscribe and 5 stars and all of that stuff. I would really appreciate it. I think you're really going to like the podcast and learn a lot. Here is Matt from PLUSPLYOS. Okay, here we go. Matt, how are you? Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks ever so much for having me on. Appreciate it.
What's going on? You're where did you say you were again?
I'm in Abu Dhabi. I'm in the United Arab Emirates out in the Middle East.
and it's getting hot.
It is. We're all getting a bit sad thinking about the summer months, because we have glorious weather from like November to early March, and next week says mid-30s, so we know that it's coming.
It's snowing here in Ireland today. So I'm not I don't have too much sympathy for you. Do you want to give us a bit of a background as to who you are, where you are, what you're doing, and we're going to talk about plyos today.
Yeah. So I'm a failed athlete, as most of us are that are not.
You're in good company.
And was a all sports kind of guy. Played football, English football, until about 17, and then got into basketball, and then was introduced to high jump, and then that's kind of been my massive route into jumping and plyometrics and speed and power training itself. And to be honest with you, the biggest reason as to why I'm so passionate about it is because of the coach that I had at the time, how he influenced me, and him realistically being my mentor for probably close to 15 years now, since I was an athlete all the way through to being a coach now. So, and he's influenced my systems, the way that I coach, and the way that I look at movement as well, especially. Mm-hmm. And kind of moving out of being a jumper, I just started to coach track and field, and then just gradually kind of found my way into different rooms of sports, moving from kind of basketball to MMA. And I think that's just because of my background and knowledge towards jumping in plyos, and how I could integrate that into training systems a bit more effectively than what was being implemented at the time. And we kind of found our way into teaching, and now we're in the UAE. I'm teaching out here full time, as well as kind of running a business and doing consultancy work on the side.
Who's the mentor?
My mentor's Eric Little. He's very kind of, he's the guy that doesn't want to be known about, and I'm dragging things out of him now. He's in his mid 70s now, and I'm really pushing more of him being confident about doing things like podcasts, and especially getting him onto our website for PLUSPLYOS. And he's going to be supporting a lot of that stuff.
Cool.
But yeah, he was involved a lot in the kind of the Polish integration in Canadian athletics, a lot around like Gerard Mock's work, and that big influence of the Eastern European side of jump training and mental work back in the 70s, kind of 80s era. So really great kind of insight into things, and having a relationship with Charlie Francis as well, because he was based in Toronto. So yeah, just great knowledge, and just type of guy that's seen everything, and nothing ever kind of surprises him, and always has a great way of explaining things. So
is he still coaching?
Not so much at the moment. He was coaching up until about 5 or 6 years ago. Where I was in the UK at the time, you know what it's like when you're, especially being involved in track and field. He was track and field coach. We don't have any indoor arenas in the UK down south, so it's coaching in 5-degree weather for 60-70% of the year. So it's not an older guy's game, I don't think, when it gets to that stage.
I just read Charlie Francis's book, Speed Trap, there a couple of months ago. It's good.
Fantastic insight, isn't it? It's just amazing.
Yeah, unbelievable. So good to see the journey, and just how he pretty much had to figure it out as he went along. And we have so many resources now and people to look to, and videos and blogs and stuff. There wasn't that much.
No, there really, really wasn't. And it's crazy, even just some of the anecdotal stuff, and the way that he talks about, like, if Ben had not put his arm up and things like that, like how much faster he would have ran, and stuff like that is my first read of Speed Trap was with a physical book, and it was signed by Charlie, because Eric gave me it. He was like, do not destroy this in any way, because he signed this for me specifically. So I had to be delicately reading it, but now I bought a digital version of it. So
yeah. Do you think that certainly in Ireland, one of my big regrets, so I grew up playing, we would call it soccer, because we have Gaelic football, hurling, played a bit of rugby, all of these things. I never did any track and field outside of like the odd school sports day, kind of, these kind of things. And I actually remember I was pretty slow when I was younger until I hit about maybe 18. I was quite not super skillful, like, but I was decent with my hands, and decision making wasn't too bad and stuff playing sports. But as an athlete, I wasn't very good. And then S&C coach here, a very, very brilliant S&C coach in Ireland, wrote me my first program, and it was in the off season. And I can actually remember going back to Gaelic football training in pre-season, and we were asked to like just run and solo the ball. And I actually couldn't solo the ball, which is like just drop the ball onto your foot and kick it back into your hands. You have to do it every 4 steps or something like that. I felt like I was going so fast that I couldn't solo the ball. And it was just after like 3 months of general old S&C stuff. And I remember when I was about 12 years old, my friend had started, actually even younger. He was 10 probably. And he went from like one of the slowest guys in our primary school class to one of the fastest guys in like 6 months. And his form just changed and everything. So I said to my mom, I want you to bring me to this athletics group. And we sat outside in the car outside the stadium where they were training, and they never went in. I was like, I don't know anyone in here. I'm afraid. And I got back in the car and we left. And it's such a regret, because I think those people who got that training in Ireland, it's probably the same in England, where there isn't as much track and field as maybe everyone is exposed to it in the States, I think. Do you think athletes are missing something there?
So much.
Mm-hmm.
It should be, I think what we miss, like the US has really, it's seasonal based. Like you move from playing football and there's a basketball season, and they have baseball season, and they have track season, and there's a constant revolving door of getting different skills and different physical work in that I think just builds such better all-round athletes. And arguably, I think getting guys to do things like the multi-events in track and field is the perfect way to be. Like, go away for the whole of the summer. If you're a soccer player, just go and do loads of multi-events training and play around with that. And it's sad because it's really poorly participated in the UK in comparison to typical British football. And the ironic part about it is I had no idea about track and field really until I was about 16, 17. I didn't even think about it because my best friend had gone to like the British champs as a high jumper. I was like, oh, he does that, and I just play football with my friends. And then I came into high jump when I was 18, and it was a completely different world. And it's funny how quickly I'd look back at the type of people that I was playing football with and just think, like, you guys are terrible, like just you're poor movers. You have no idea how out of shape you are, even as like a 16, 17-year-old lad. And just movement patterns are terrible. Yeah, it's sad how badly sport, it takes away so much in terms of the physical capacities of individuals. And you see it with basketball players, they just spend so much time in a certain intensity of work, and it just creates that kind of beast. And you're like, I listened to a bit of the Jake Tura podcast, and you guys are talking about that. Like, you just spend so much time doing, stuff that might not be valuable. Yeah. It's just playing random pickup basketball good for your game, maybe, but maybe it's really not. And the physical side of it could be developed so well from that.
Do you think that, because in theory, like, I play basketball or football every day, I move better and better and better, but doesn't necessarily seem to be the case, where it seems to be like I get to a certain baseline and then I kind of stay there for whatever reason. Do you think it's the ball that's doing that? I think I heard Franz Bosch talk about this before, where he like, I was on a webinar and he slammed soccer players, football players. He was like, they move like shit. I was like, oh, it's a little bit harsh. He was talking about like Premier League players. I was like, they are covering serious ground and doing serious things. Maybe that's a little bit harsh, but he was trashing them. I suppose he was holding his model of movement up there and comparing them to that. And he said it's because the intention of the system is to like control the ball, not to actually improve my sprint technique or my plyometric or whatever it is. And I think that maybe makes sense. What do you think? Do you think it is the ball that's getting in the way of that, or just the intention that I'm not actually here to make every step better?
It has to be. 400 of the world's best footballers can't move badly as footballers.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? Like it's and the goal is to be better at controlling a football and holding possession and being able to manipulate the ball away from defenders and stuff. Realistically, it doesn't have to make sense biomechanically. Do you know what I mean? I think that how much do you give up in terms of the ball when realistically, you know, when you have people like footballers or basketball players, like everything about them is about that ball. And like I notice it, even as like a PE teacher, you notice it on the most basic level. There's a few kids that are amazing at football and a few kids that want to play basketball. You put any shaped ball out and the footballers will play with their feet and the basketballers will pick the ball up. You know what I mean? Like there's that inherently built-in thing that I think it's really tough to look at those physical sides and say, oh, well, you know, they move terribly or they sprint badly. And like you're saying, all right, great. But are they going to be able to move and run for 10 kilometers in a 90-minute game with fantastic biomechanical form? It's just not realistic, I don't think. Mm-hmm. Their bodies are intelligent enough to, you know, to figure things out a bit better.
Yeah.
I guess the biggest problem is those guys that sit under those, you know, sub-elite footballers. Like, why aren't they? Is it the physical side that they could be working on, or is it purely the football side and the skill level? That's a question that I'm definitely not qualified to answer in any way, shape, or form. But
I don't know if anyone is. Yeah, that's the problem. But then the other argument is so the argument you'll certainly get in Gaelic football and hurling in Ireland is, why would I practice sprinting? Because I'm not going to look like a sprinter on the field. I'm not going to get upright like that and blah, 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 blah. I'm like, that's such a weak argument. Yeah. You don't have to look like Usain Bolt sprinting. Firstly, you won't. That's like the same argument as someone who goes to the gym for 6 weeks and is like, I don't want to get too big. It's like, you're not going to, don't worry. But surely they can go and practice these. When you look at, I go down to the RSC, which is our track down here. I worked with Waterford FC, which was our local football team. The Irish League obviously isn't as strong as the English League, but like there's still some good players there. And I worked with them a few years ago, and we were training every day. The pitch was there and the track was around it, so we'd see some very good 400-meter runners who would be competing in European championships and stuff like that. And I remember one day we were walking off the pitch after a session with the guys, and there was two very, very good European 200 and 400s running, and they were going hard now. And the guys nearly fell over looking at the efficiency. And I was like, you don't think that practicing some plyometrics and stuff like this might not improve how you move on the field? You know, it doesn't have to have a ball involved. Am I right?
I think so. I think even if you wanted an athlete or a footballer or whatever, if you want them to move faster, you want to bring in a speed side of movement or more plyometrically based stuff, then they need to step away from the game anyway. I think because the likelihood is their kind of unsafe movement mechanics is not going to be preferable for doing maybe if you're looking at maximal sprinting. Mm-hmm. So moving them onto a track, they're probably going to change things slightly anyway. But I think you want to impart more force, you've got to do it in more of you could call it more of a clinical way in comparison to like the field. Take them away from that. Absolutely. If you're not, it's like training beyond the demands of the sport, right? You want some of that. You want to be able to say, okay, I'm 20 minutes into a game and there's an opportunity for me to unleash some of the stuff that I've been working on off of the field in a 5-second bout where I'm gonna knock the ball past someone and sprint around them and get an equalizer or something like that. It has to be there. You can't just sit at this kind of very mellow level, especially with field sports. They move at such a slow velocity for a long period of time. So endurance runners do speed work. They don't just run miles. There are inherent speed sessions within it. It might not be speed to a sprinter, but they're running 200s or they're running 300s. Yeah. So it has to be there to build capacities that are going to notch up their overall playing level.
Yeah, and I think like those physical qualities that they're maybe built in from some plyometrics workouts and some sprinting workouts and stuff like that, that's still carrying over to submaximal work on the field during a game. Like your ankle is moving a bit better, your foot is moving a bit better, you're a little bit more reactive. That has to carry over as well, doesn't it?
Has to. The perfect example of that is my coach always used to kind of go back to my mentor Eric and say, like, why do we do speed work as a high jumper? Like I don't have to potentially run that fast. Like world-class high jumping is 8 meters a second to jump like world-class 240, top 10 ever. And he said, well, let's say that it's your 70% of your maximal velocity. He said, if your 70% is faster than the guy next to you, you're going to find 8 meters per second or whatever that speed might be easier. So you're going to be able to, use skills better because I'm at a slower speed. I can understand things. It's easier for me to put things together. So like things like that are great examples of it. If you're looking at improving submaximal capacities, it seems stupid to continually work at submaximal capacity, right?
Yeah.
If you want to improve your 5 rep max, getting stronger at the top end of it is going to help that. So there has to be you've got to work past it in order for it to be lifted as well.
Yeah. Okay. So language wise, you're probably sick of talking about this because I have seen you talk about this. No, not necessarily. I'm certainly not sick of hearing you talk about it, but classifying our plyometrics. And I know you have different tiers of plyometrics. So at least I think it's important to get the language right. I'm definitely guilty of changing my language a lot, depending on who I'm talking to and stuff like that. But just something might sound right at the time, and actually it's not correct at all. So how would you go about, firstly, what is a plyometric movement, how you classify them things, and the tiers that you classify them into?
Yeah. So plyometrics is the simplest form is, well, for me and how I interpret it, is there has to be a landing and a takeoff sequence to the movement. And it has to be pretty fast. That's as simple as it gets. And the contact time speeds, are apparently 0.25 seconds and below. If it's 0.26, probably still reasonably plyometric.
Yeah.
I think, there's like a bandwidth there. I think you're playing with kind of 0.22 and 0.28 or something like that. As soon as you creep past 0.3 of a second, it's going to look slower. It's going to use less of an elastic property to the movement. So,
is there somewhere that number initially came from?
So it initially comes from Verkhoshansky's stuff in super training, where he talks about the amortization phase and how long the longest amount of time you should spend in that for a plyometric. And he speculated 0.15, which seems like a really long time. So I think if it was to be revamped today, I would probably put it more towards 0.1 of a second in the amortization phase, because the loading and then the pop out of it is probably going to be pretty fast. So if you're looking at a movement that's within kind of 0.22 or something like that, it makes sense at about 0.1, the amortization. And that's when we're talking about, a bilateral movement or something like that. Unilateral stuff where you're moving towards more sprint stuff, we know how fast that is. That's kind of under 0.1 of a second for world class. It's just really important to go with, if it's got a landing and takeoff, it's probably really close to being plyometric. And if someone spends too long on the floor, when you look at it visually, it's plyometric. And that's how I look at things. There's a lot of people that want to stay true to the shock method and all this sort of stuff. And, there has to be super maximal force and the ground reaction forces have to be super high. But all right, cool. Well, tell me what one movement is in comparison to another without having a force plate there. So if it's relatively fast, then it's plyometric to me. And if we were to kind of stagger our plyometric movements, if we're looking at the language of different movements, I just go with 3 main ones are 2 unilateral movements and 1 bilateral movement. Our bilateral movement, I term a leap, 2 feet to 2 feet. Termed it a leap because Eric said these are leaps. So all right, cool. Well, I'm going to use the word leap. Okay. Some people call it a jump. Maybe it's better to call it a jump, but I've gone with leap because I think people get it twisted a little bit. Do you jump across a puddle? Do you leap across a puddle? Or do you hop across a puddle? Who knows?
So I need to change my leaping language then, because I was coaching gymnastics a few years ago, and they do they would call it a split leap, where it's not a plyometric then, because there's a split in the air, but maybe they're jumping off two. No, they're probably jumping off one and landing on the other.
Yeah. So it's more of like a bound in the air. It's
probably a bound, with that split in the air then,
Yeah. So that's the bilateral side of things. If we look at the unilateral side of things, we've got the unipedal version and the bipedal version. So our bipedal version, moving from one leg to the other, but on one limb at a time. I like to use this terminology as well. So our unilateral bipedal movement is bounding from one leg to the other. And these are the ones that get destroyed the most, is hopping and bounding, because people are like, oh, I was doing 1 foot hopping. And I'm like, well, it's just hopping then. Or like one-legged bounding. And I'm like, well, why can't you just give it another name? Otherwise we're going to, so. And the other is hopping, unilateral unipedal movement. You're just using one limb to propel yourself along continuously, is hopping. So we've got our bilateral, and our bilateral leaping can also be done in a split stance as well.
Okay.
And that's I will call it a split exchange leap, where you're moving the front leg back and forth. And then we have a split stance leap, where you hold that split stance and you don't exchange.
Okay. Yeah. So there's no switch in the air.
No switch in the air. So one of them, the split exchange is the switch. The split stance is just holding that stance.
Okay, cool.
And that is realistically, like, name another form of human locomotion. It's pretty hard to come up with. Those patterns fit pretty much everything.
Yeah.
Obviously you have combinations. The only combination that I have a term for, without it being like a hop step, is what I call a jump. And I just use the wording from things like long jump and triple jump, where you take off of one and you land on two. That's a jump to me.
Okay, cool. Okay, so I'm going to call out a few exercises, then you can just to help clarify that. So a double leg pogo on the spot is a what?
Is a leap.
Is a leap. Okay.
Yeah. So you could call it a pogo leap if you wanted to. When you're looking at I know people like, it's a stiff position, so they'll call it like a pogo. They love to use the word pogo, but then we get one-legged pogos. I'm like,
So a one-legged pogo is a hop.
Is a hop. Yeah.
Is a hop. And that doesn't matter if it's in the spot or going forward, it's still a hop.
Still a hop.
Then going right leg to left leg and traveling in space or whatever is a bound.
Is a bound, yeah.
Yeah. And then, so if I'm jumping off two legs and landing back in a split position, that's a split leap. And then if I switch in the air, it's a split exchange leap.
Exactly.
Okay, cool.
Hopefully that's not too confusing.
No, I've got my head around that. I'm very close to you on the language stuff anyway. Just the leap would be different for me.
I mean, I think if you can, what's important is the people that you work with. The language has to work. Mm-hmm. If it's not then used around the industry or whatever it might be, or within literature, like I've been doing stuff with my PhD at the moment, and I've written something on the terminology of things, and just asking for, we're at a stage of research. Why don't we have videos of what the movement looks like?
Exactly.
Why are we not at that stage? Like, we're still in the stone ages of writing online. We might as well just be giving out, printed out versions of literature now, instead of. So I want to see like either a video or a kinematic movement description.
Yeah. I
want to see what that looks like. But if it's the same terminology that you use throughout your organization or whatever it might be, your group of people, then it's great. And I think that you could interchange leaps and jumps if you wanted to. I don't see a problem with that.
I do think it's important for us to try and get to where we can I can have a conversation with you and we know what we're talking about. And with everyone, the research stuff, that's why I'm so skeptical of studies now, because I'm not a skeptic in general. Like, I think the research is fairly solid, and I don't really like people shitting all over it and stuff. But like, if someone talks about a simple movement, a seemingly simple movement, like we looked at this squat and whatever the adaptation of the squat was, like, show me the squat. Let me have a look at this squat to see what it looks like, because there's a lot of different squats out there. And then when you start to talk about something like a plyometric movement, it's so much more complex. Show me the plyo.
Yeah,
You
absolutely.
know?
And with the systematic review that I'm just trying to publish at the moment, like just the stuff of within plyometrics is so bad. 1,400 papers and 700 of them weren't using plyometrics.
Okay.
Like straight off the bat, like they just using counter movement based work. There is no landing to the takeoff sequence. Like straight away, like in the title it said plyometrics. I'm like, okay, cool. Let me look at it. No, it's not plyometrics.
Yeah.
That shows you straight away.
You see that everywhere. You see on Instagram, S&C coach, look how good I am at plyometrics, and they do a counter movement jump. You know, so that's interesting. Okay, and then the tiers that you have in your coaching.
Yeah, so the tiers are pretty. I wouldn't say they're anything, spectacular, but it's a great way to build what I'll call it a plyometric spectrum. I don't like progressions to things because I think the spectrum should be there for all athletes and should just be used for different things throughout the season. It's not like there's so much like I start at A and I finish a depth jumps and shot method. Like I really want to push that more and more. Like just because you're a world-class athlete doesn't mean that you can't be using the lightest forms of movement, because there's value to that all the time. Yeah. So in terms of how that's scaled along the spectrum of kind of intensity, we use a light tier, which is very kind of extensive. We like to keep the ground contact times short because the ground reaction forces are pretty low. So it's like doing, the perfect phrase would be doing a light pogo for someone, it's very extensive. There's a nice landing pattern. We use that to do thousands of different variations of movements. I think it's amazing for introduction to plyos. It's amazing for an introduction to a session. I think that athletes should be using it in every single warm-up that they do if they're doing any dynamic form of movement. And it's a great way for thickening tendons. I found that more and more that I use, especially for female athletes, they're like high volumes of light kind of plyometric movements, and it's great for just building a little bit more resilience to tendons. I found, especially in the ankle and lower limbs. And then if we move along the spectrum, we've got our kind of what we class as our medium tier, which is pretty much exactly as it says. It's still a sub-maximal plyometric, but it's quite more locomotive. You're looking at bounding and hopping, but it's not maximal. It's typical extensive plyometrics. And then the upper echelon is our maximal tier, which we class as ping. And it's just a phrase that we've always used within the group of friends that I've worked with, and especially with Eric, my mentor. And the final one is, I'll always say that it's not specifically plyometric, but there is a landing and takeoff sequence to all of the movements, and that's what we call our deep tier. And we have a lot more of a deeper range of motion. I see a lot of, there's a lot of people that use deep long range movement within the gym and stuff, but not a lot of people use it with a full landing and a full takeoff. There's always like stiff, resilient stuff when it comes to plyos, and it's special. Like that's the only way I can describe it. Like I'm excited to try and do a little bit of research. After I finish my PhD, I'd like to do a little bit on that and look at what's coming from that, because I can make speculations from what I see with it and how athletes really enjoy to use it for even doing things like, if I want to get a bit more ankle mobility out of someone, I just do deeper range work. Yep. And especially with movement, like it can have a pretty good correlation for that sort of stuff. And the relationship of it is really, really quite nice.
That's why you're saying you don't really like the word progression, because the progression would imply that, okay, I'm following some Russians' work here, and I'm going to start with your lighter work or whatever, your extensive work, and then an athlete gets to the stage where it's just intensive. We're looking for like shock type work, and there's never going to be any deeper joint angles, or going into deeper dorsiflexion, knee flexion, hip flexion, things like this. And maybe if I'm a 100-meter sprinter, maybe I don't need too much of that. But definitely but maybe they do. Maybe they just need the opposite of what they're getting in their sprinting. Maybe they just feel really good from doing it.
I use a lot of deep tier movements before I do acceleration sessions. It has a great carryover. People use things like repeated broad jumps, don't they? Things like that. Like I've used similar things like that, and it's good because athletes because especially in an acceleration kind of mechanic, when you've got your foot out in front of you and the foot has to stay stiff, but your pelvis has to move over the top of it. The deep tier stuff, you might still have a pretty stiff ankle for that athlete when they do deep tier movements. Still have to transition and be able to hold that force on that, that position of that foot when it's in a bit more of a vulnerable position as opposed to being directly upright in a solid posture. So it does have a slight crossover into quite a few different sports, which I find really valuable.
Yeah, I'm really interested in that work. I came across, I don't know, you probably haven't, but there's a company called Fighting Monkey. They're kind of into like Ido Portal world and stuff like that. And they do a lot of, it's kind of dance type movement, to be honest. You pay a lot of money to go to a workshop where you could have went to a dance class, but they do coordinations where like it's really the arms are swinging. They coordinate the swing of the arms with like little hops or little bounds and stuff like this. And then they all coordinate it into a dance. I was looking at some of that stuff. I was like, that's actually really nice. Aside from you don't need to learn this exact coordination. You just need to learn what they're trying to teach from it. That's really, really nice. And I even put up a video on Instagram the other day of an athlete who I was saying like these kind of slightly, not older athletes, but athletes who have had a lot of injuries over the years, how they stiffen up. They're waiting to hit the floor and it's like this brace through their entire body. Like we talk about co-contractions around the ankle, which is a good thing and all this stuff when you're preparing for contact, but you just see co-contractions in their entire body in the air. And sometimes I cue just like let the arms relax. I don't care about how short the contact here is. I just want you to actually feel the floor so that you can then move away from it onto the other leg and stuff like that. And I think maybe your deep tier stuff is very valuable, more valuable than people think.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's so much to it. And by the way, I'm so happy the way that you explained that you're visually seeing so much with athletes that, everyone talks about co-contraction and how valuable it is and preparing for the floor, but rocks don't bounce for a reason. Like that's the perfect phrase for it. Like you can't go and then expect to be like, I'm ready for the ground. Mm-hmm. What do they say about people that are intoxicated when they fall over or get hurt? They're always they're big accidents and they're like roll out of something. They're completely fine. Yeah. There's no co-contraction. They just move like rubber off the floor. It's the same principle. Obviously, there needs to be that stability of the lower leg, but yeah, that side of training is really starting to come in, and I've been working a lot more in that space. There's so much on the ground side of work, but what's happening in the air is becoming more and more important. And we kind of swept past that research that came in about pre-activation and preparing for the floor. And Komi and the guys in Finland have done a lot of that stuff, and then we kind of swept past it. We've not kind of re-entered it with, I think, more of a coaching side to things and understanding what that looks like visually rather than trying to test it in some way or form. Because I think the testing side of it's quite limited anyway. But
yeah. So when you say pre-activation, then what's happening? What does that mean to you? First of all, what's happening at my body when I'm preparing for that contact? Actually, maybe not use my body, but someone who can jump. What's happening there? What does that mean to you? How activated am I? And where are we talking about the pre-activation? Obviously, around the lower leg, but how far up my body does that go, or do we know? Or is that a really hard question?
No. It's the research that's out there and that has been relatively quality research. It's a lot of it's surface EMG stuff. So, however valid you see that form of testing is entirely how you view that. But there's some research to suggest that the contraction of some of the lower leg muscles are in world-class athletes are about 80% of maximal contraction
before they hit the floor.
Oh,
nice.
So there's quite a steep correlation for that, and they found that they were using triple jumpers, and in Finland they used some world class. Okay, maybe not world, they're not going to win Olympic medals, these guys, but they're probably, tapping on being able to make things like the European Championships. So they're pretty good athletes. And there was quite a drop off when it came to like just a standard national athlete. There was more around like the 60% marker. And they found that the elite athletes were pre-activating for longer periods of time. So like before the sub-elite guys, and the rate in which they like sped up their contraction in terms of what was read on that was like a steep curve. It was kind of like, it was like a dull, and then poof, it skyrocketed.
Spike, yeah.
The sub-elite guys, it was kind of like I'm getting ready for the ground. Oh, and that's probably the bit that I've missed. A lot of that is, I now understand it in terms of the research that I've read, and I look back to guys and think, that's why I didn't understand it at that time. I see that guy's not pre-activating well for the ground. And that's how I understand the stability around a joint now, and how I look at how energy is coupled. So when you look at the muscles that are, what you want to be pre-activated, you're looking at things like tibs, you're looking at gastroc, soleus. I don't know anything about the feet, because I think that's probably up there with some of the most important stuff that you could probably find, and the links into, hallucus longus and things like that. I think that would be really, really good stuff. But again, not sure how that would work, trying to get EMG readings on a foot, and how that would then move around when you hit the ground. So
yeah. And then what about, is there anything there around like VL, hamstrings, stuff like that?
Yeah, a little bit. I think there's quite a big relationship, especially with unilateral movements, for things like VMO is quite high. And hamstring. I think there was a relationship between VL and hamstring being relatively similar in terms of the timing. And VMO, I think, was a kind of like a fast spike, and kind of held there to be like, right, I need to be ready for this.
I think so. Yeah, it's got to be. I think that'd be interesting to see with.
Yeah, I'm gonna revisit that stuff in terms of the data on that, because it intrigues me to dig a little bit more into maybe what has come out more recently.
It's really interesting, because like you hear people talk about these words, pre-activation and stuff, and what does that, what do they mean when they say that, or what are again, like the terminology we're using? Are we talking about the same thing here? I think then that just maybe kind of made sense to me there, that those elite or just sub-elite athletes, then looking at them in the air, I would imagine then their upper body looks more relaxed, and it's probably a nervous system, a brain that's saying, okay, you have the ability to pre-activate and co-contract distally, so you don't need as much proximally. And I would say it's the exact opposite then for someone in the rehab process, or a worse athlete like me, who I feel like, okay, I can't do this distally, so I'm trying to just get some tension wherever I can, and next thing, my neck, my jaw is tensing and all of this stuff, and whether you can cue someone out of that, I don't know, probably not. Whether it's just a case of finding the right variation for them and actually giving them some reps and building confidence in that. I don't know. What do you think there? Is there a cue you can use?
There are kind of very basic beginner cues that I think last maybe a few weeks, but it has to be part of a subconscious motor pattern. It cannot be conscious, because then when we bring in the co-contractions in places where you don't want it to be. And that's what you get. Obviously, if we were to look at the novice guys in comparison to kind of, sub-elite triple jumpers are still better movers than the average Joe Blogg. So the novice guys they'll skyrocket in terms of how much they can pre-activate over a short period of time. But that difference between the sub-elite and elite is that difference of subconsciousness, and it being a kind of a response to elasticity, and knowing that when I whip my foot into the ground, especially if we're talking about things like triple jump, that there's a volition in that I'm not afraid to handle at X speed, because that's also what has a big correlation in things like triple jump, is the velocity in which you're carrying it into hitting the ground. And hopping is unique in that as well. And I'll always use hopping as a really good way to teach subconscious overload to a guy. You'll understand that. I put a video up of novice hoppers in comparison to like a pro hopper. They'll hold that leg in extension. They will not pick that foot up and whip it back down into the ground.
Yeah.
And that's because they don't want to handle the overload.
Yeah.
They don't want that force. Whereas when you get to more of an intermediate or elite version of someone that can hop well, you're dealing with a leg that has to whip through at twice the speed as a bound, an alternating stance, which automatically spikes the ground reaction force, whether you like it or not.
Mm-hmm.
And then the best movers are then able to deal with that force and continue propulsion. So using hopping is like the ultimate way in teaching subconscious patterns, because you have to have that leg back down there for you to continue to propel yourself. And it's the same feeling as coming downstairs in the middle of the night and you think there's another step and you go woof and you catch yourself. That's hopping constantly. So it's something that cool.
That's the gold standard for me in terms of rehab. If I had someone with a knee injury, Achilles, it actually doesn't matter what the injury was and they need to get back sprinting and stuff like that. If they can demonstrate to me that they can hop for distance, but not a hop, but actually cycle that leg in the air and come back to the floor, like I don't need to ask them anything else. Their body, their nervous system is showing me we are confident here. I'm pretty much ready to do anything else once I can get that movement done. The cycling, that's the action that you're talking about, that cycling action rather than just keeping that leg stiff.
Yeah, exactly.
That's the big difference.
Yeah, it's that subconscious effect that you have no control over it if you want to maintain that that biomechanical position. Yeah.
Okay, so that's the kind of pre-activation stuff. So this is starting to get into a speculation because maybe we don't know then, but when that foot hits the floor, I'll leave you choose the type of movement that you want to use as an example. But so the best athletes are going to be 80% activated or something like that. When that foot hits the floor, then what do you think is happening at the muscle? So let's say like soleus or gastrocs or something like that. And what do you think is happening at something like the Achilles tendon? Because people seem to be unsure about that. Is the muscle actually eccentrically loading? Is it isometric? Or is it actually maybe concentric so they can actually stretch the tendon more? Traditionally, we would have thought, right, foot hits the floor, heel is going to descend, muscle is eccentrically loading, then there's an isometric, then there's a concentric. I'm not so sure.
I think if we look at the Achilles stuff, there's been some conflicting thoughts in my mind because of some of the research that I've read, and people are saying that there is concentric contraction of calf for you to get more of a pull on
as the heel descends.
As the heel descends,
which is the opposite of what you would have thought traditionally years ago.
Well, yeah, not as the heel descends, but as the shin moves forward.
As the shin moves forward, yeah.
As you get positive shin angle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm a little scared that it goes along with the S&C kind of co-contraction world. You know what I mean? Like everything has to be solid, ready. And I'm wondering if I get a little bit scared that it's a bit towards that direction of things, and the speculation of it is a bit much because I'm not sure about the active relationship of when I concentrically contract, like how does that work with the tendon? I feel like it's more of an isometric. I feel like the muscle is already positioned for those top guys. I think that maybe as you're coming in, there's some sort of contraction, and then as you land, there's an isometric stance to that, and the tendon takes the lengthening. Mm-hmm. And then as you move through the stance, what I get confused on is I don't know how the muscle will work as it moves through the stance of it. You know, as you move through mid stance and off of toe off, how do I go from a concentric contraction and then concentrically contract out of that? You know what I mean? Like, and the relationship with what pulls on what at what time.
Yeah.
It's really, it destroys my head a little bit thinking about
it's hard. It has to it's hard. There has to be, so the key thing for people to probably understand is the muscle is trying to shorten all the time. Even if it's eccentrically loading and lengthening, it's trying to shorten. It's just not winning that battle. So I think that's maybe where people get confused. Maybe. Yeah. I don't know.
I think what would be interesting is to see the change in length of tendon, and what I really would like to see is the speed in which it changes length, and how you can look at that between an elite and a sub-elite guy. I'd really like to know whether, if you've got like a really elastic triple jumper in comparison to maybe more of a power guy, how does that relationship change? Or if you've got a guy that's more stout and has a bigger, thicker calf in comparison to like a West African high calf and really long tendon based. That sort of stuff really interests me, to see how quickly that might change in length in comparison to sub-elite guys, and the relationship to, how that carries elastic transfer and energy through. But it's
there's no answer there yet, but I find it really interesting. So when someone, do you use the word stiffness? Is that a word that you would use in your vocabulary when describing plyometrics?
Are you talking about when I coach? Or
not necessarily when you coach, but so I hear a lot of people, there's a bit of an argument maybe online about is stiffness, because there is some movement there, because there is movement, why should we use the word stiff? Because nothing is stiff. Would you use the word stiffness, not in coaching an athlete, but when describing a movement?
Yeah, I think it's a word that has, I think it has some sort of biomechanical connotation to it. That there's not freedom of movement through it. So do you know what I mean? If I can't think of another term that I would use, put it that way.
And if you were using it, what would you be describing then in the movement?
It depends, because sometimes, like when I discuss stiffness, there's a relationship to whatever I put to it. So it might be that if I'm talking about tendon stiffness, or if I'm talking about joint stiffness, I think that there's different timings as to when that happens, and I think the joint stiffness part is more towards the neurological side than it is towards the physiological side of adaptations. You might get joint stiffness, and great, I've got athletes that, they're doing loads of pogos and they're getting really stiff Achilles tendon. But all right, cool, when you hop in a horizontal momentum based fashion, what happens? Does my Achilles hold that stiffness? No, it doesn't, because it doesn't have that neural connection to understand how I'm pre-activating, and the relationship to the rest of the stirrup of the ankle, and how that works backwards and forwards with what holds stiffness at a given point. So there's definitely two sides to it, and we're getting at the moment this all-encompassing stiffness word, and I think there has to be a slight separation to that.
That's what I mean. And then if you're talking about joint stiffness, so where is there a point in this might be with coaching, like where would you start to think, okay, actually someone's missing some range of motion, where the ankle here is actually not moving well enough, the midfoot isn't moving well enough, or the heel bone isn't moving well enough? And is that something you would consider, or with regards to okay, can do some mobility work to help them? Or is that maybe just they need to relax in their plyometrics a bit more and try not to be as stiff? Or does that just depend?
I use some anecdotal stuff of when I see an athlete that lifts their heel too early in the transition of a landing and takeoff. I often just do a very crude, simple measure of knee to wall, and just see what the dorsiflexion distance is. And often an athlete that's not kind of between 12 and 15 centimeters often displays that. It's anecdotal, but a lifting of the heel has quite a big relationship with Achilles issues, because the Achilles is not getting the support of the hip as the shin moves positively. And that extension needs to happen further up the chain before the foot can kind of uncoil off of the floor.
Yeah.
Otherwise, you do just get too much stress on the Achilles. So I just use simple measuring tools like that to assess a basic level of stiffness. And if there's an extra nuance to it where it still doesn't have a relationship, then that's when I'll look at integrating things like deep tier movements and seeing how that then happens with different timings and stuff. Because it could be an air-based thing. It could be a co-contraction in the air that's messing with, like, it's too much for me in terms of the overload, and therefore I need to get off the foot quicker. Yeah. Things like that have a bit of a correlation too. Yeah. So yeah, that's a real simple method that I use, and it does have quite a good, result that I've found is just some simple dorsiflexion work that has been quite effective in making sure that it kind of reduces Achilles issues, especially. Yeah.
When you talk, or when you're looking at what's happening when the foot is hitting the floor in terms of foot contact, can you kind of, is there a sweet spot? And obviously that will depend on the plyometric that you're actually doing, but maybe you can give us a few different examples of a couple of different types of plyometrics and where you might see that foot contact, or where you might see it actually go wrong. Or is that too broad?
Do you know what? I don't actually think that there is much of a difference between any landing. Like, I genuinely don't feel like it. I don't like the idea of rolling from the heel to the toe when you use unilateral based horizontal movements, because if your heel goes down first, it says to me that there's a braking force involved, and you're trajecting with your heel, which I often find that there's an extension pattern that's come all the way through the knee, and the force that you're going to get in your hamstring, as opposed to stacking it more into your hip and how that goes through the rest of your posture. I think there's a bit of that gets thrown around by coaches, and I don't think it's as effective as trying to get the foot underneath the hip all the time. Yeah. So
would that be more of a midfoot contact then?
Yeah. So where I look at things, I coach a full foot landing. Not flat foot, but full foot, because flat doesn't sound good. Yeah. But yeah, a full foot landing where I get athletes to aim for a certain part of their foot when they're learning how to do things, and maybe if I need to reintroduce that as a coaching cue, but to look just behind the kind of knuckle of the ball of the foot, that it's like a tickle spot underneath there, which I think has a good relationship with how the plantar fascia flexes a little bit and how that receives load. Because I think if it's any further forward than that, then you're getting more of a forefoot loading, which again, does it lift the heel? Yeah, so there could have a slightly different relation to that. Yeah. But most of the time, that means in a good solid heel supported trainer that you're going to get a full foot contact.
Yeah. So the heel will be coming down. Obviously, it will be hitting the floor. Yeah. But you're not actually cueing like a heel contact first, where I'm going to roll onto the midfoot from there. It's actually probably more I hit midfoot and then I hit heel, rather than I hit heel and then I hit midfoot.
Yeah, I'd say that. Most of the time, honestly, with a good example for me is using like a good solid Asics or Mizuno running trainer that's quite stiff in the midfoot. It does have a slight heel to it, and you can walk through it well. You're going to land full foot. It's going to be quite a full foot landing, and it's at the same time, I think that it does have good kind of dynamic connotation to it, and the way that it places underneath your hip, because that's more of an important part to it for me, is not thinking about so much about where you're landing on your foot, but more towards where you're landing in relationship to your center of mass. Yeah. You're always, if you're moving horizontally, you're always going to land that foot slightly out in front. That's locomotion for you. But our goal is to try and get it in a cue. I think is to try and get it as close to under the hip as possible, because they're always going to want to produce more force, and to do that, I put my foot further out in front of me to get more of a pull, and more time on the ground to do that.
Yeah. And then is there any commonalities you would see with something like shin splints, or maybe someone with Achilles issues, in terms of maybe where they're contacting the foot, or anything else?
big relationship with forefoot landers and shin issues, definitely.
Yeah.
I find that and the same. I see issues with shins with heel first landers, because you'll often see that there's a real increase in ground contact time as well, because you often get that the heel lands and then you get this snap of the tibs anterior really struggles to control it, so you get like a whack of the front of the foot. And I think that puts way too much stress on that. And tibs posterior as well, in terms of the struggle that the athletes tend to get in there. It's often because of how much tension they're getting through soleus when they're trying to hold more of a forefoot contact.
Yeah.
There's just constant fatigue through that. I always do that with jumpers. They're like, oh, my shins are sore. And I'm like, let me have a feel for the belly of that muscle. And they're like, oh my, that is so bad. They always complaining to me about shin splints. And I'm like, it's probably the muscles in and around there that are just absolutely fried.
Jacked up. Yeah. I see, definitely with shin issue people, it's very hard. Firstly, they probably just did too much as well. But why it was too much for that exact structure, that's another question. Like, so why wasn't it too much for your knee, or why wasn't it too much for your hip or whatever? It was the shin that got it. So maybe there is some biomechanical factors here, and then the too much happened, like the injury happened or the issue happened as a result of doing too much, but because of the factors that were there maybe in the first place. I definitely think I'm careful with making claims or anything, but I see an complete inability usually to use the midfoot. And that kind of makes sense, because that's where all the joints in the foot are as well. There should be some yield there into the floor, and joints are there to this, obviously. Like, if you think about my spine, I can move my spine, I can pick up a pen, I can round my full back to pick up a pen and spread the load across the full spine. Look at the foot, all the complexity in the foot is in the midfoot. Someone actually can't move that midfoot. So like, that force is just shooting straight up into the body and I haven't dispersed anything before it's got there. So yeah, just when you just look at a foot, that should kind of make sense.
Yeah, exactly. And I find as well that when there's more of a forefoot landing, I think there's a higher co-contraction of your soleus. It overrides how much co-contraction is in the calf. When you have more of a toes up position as you're coming into co-contract to then whip down, you have like an opposite and equal reaction of what's firing and what's like releasing at the right times. When someone's coming in, you often see like a novice guy that's kind of got their toes out in front of them, legs are straight, and they're wondering why, they're getting sore shins, or in behind the shin is sore. And I think that it's just too much. And then the subsequent action of it is the heel drops so fast.
Yeah.
And like you say, the reverberation of force just flies up there.
Yeah. So you're almost seeing like two opposite ends of the spectrum. One is hitting the heel down first.
Yeah,
quite a lot, and then the rest of the foot just slaps into the floor. And then the opposite is one is hitting the toes down first, and then the rest of the foot is slapping down into the floor. And it with all movement as well, hopefully maybe finding that middle ground.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, cool.
Yeah,
okay.
I will say as well, for bilateral movements, that people go with that cue of being able to kind of slide a credit card underneath your heel when you land bilaterally. And I think that there's a safe measure to that. I don't normally find an issue with bilateral movements as opposed to what I do with unilateral movements. I think you can get away with more of a little bit more up into the forefoot, but not dramatically more.
Yeah. Okay. In that instance, like, is any amount of calf raises, tibialis anterior work going to actually help? It will flush out the muscle a little bit and give it a chance to lengthen and shorten, but if I don't change the pattern, I'm probably going to struggle.
We had a track and field group of jumpers and triple jumpers, and for me to say that we probably accumulated over 1,000 landings a night on some of our big plyo nights, and we'd walk away without shin issues. And in my 8 years as a high jumper, I didn't do a single calf raise, and I jumped 7 feet in a high jump. So, and I never did any shin work whatsoever. That for me, like light tier plyometrics, there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so interesting. And then Well, that's the accumulating the body of work. Obviously, again, if you're as a kid, if you can play basketball all your life, it's going to be a lot better than trying to reintroduce plyometrics without any sport when I'm 25 years old or something like that.
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. So then it gets very difficult, because the thing for an Achilles issue or a shin issue is training plyometrics and training them really well and getting the contacts in. But the reason they can't get the contacts in is because they have the issue. So it's like a vicious circle that I think a lot of coaches, a lot of rehab professionals struggle with that, including me. It's hard.
Yeah. I think we can play the hindsight card a little bit, but it's a case of educating people enough so that, having an athlete that's able to handle hundreds of light landings before they ever get to a stage of having an Achilles issue is probably going to sort them for life.
Yeah.
Like I genuinely I've probably been doing plyometrics, I'd say at least every 10 days for the last 12 years. And I aim to try and do it until the age of 60. Like that's my goal. Because I think I'll never ever have an issue with falling in older age because of that. I think that's a big piece of research that needs to be put out there, like teaching people how to land. I've never ever had an Achilles issue, and that's because of just the accumulative load of just being able to continue tapping into that. And again, anecdotally, it's not an area that I find to have issues with my athletes, especially. I think that I
see you jumping. You can use your foot really well, really, really well. Have you done force plate like work on not necessarily on plyometrics yourself, but on strength, in terms of strength in the lower leg and stuff like that? Have you ever checked that?
A little, not too much. I can't remember if we did any maybe back when I was in uni. Like I had quite a good team around me when I was in uni. I had a good S&C team and stuff. But I'm trying to think, I can't remember. I know we did some like isokinetic testing and stuff like that to test strength, but I can't remember the force plate stuff. We did plenty of takeoff stuff. We did do some plyometric stuff, but isolated stuff. Not too much, no. What I'm interested in is seeing a physio in the next kind of 5-10 years, and then to be like, why are your tendons like? I remember the first physio I ever saw, like, your Achilles tendons are huge, and I was like, you've never dealt with a jumper before, I think. But it's I often get that trying to manipulate things as well, especially when you're dealing with a stiff athlete. Trying to manipulate a heel and stuff when you've got a sprinter that works on a foot that does not move a lot. It
helps though, doesn't it? That's the one place I'm not a big fan of manual therapy. I think it's fine. I don't like doing it because I'm lazy, and I think there's better ways. But the one place that I think manipulations and mobilizations can really work is the heel bone and maybe the first met. I think that can help people get into their midfoot, and they can feel you see Achilles issues going away very quickly when they start to be able to get just some movement there.
Yeah, I remember having issues with getting a little bit of pain in and around, like this kind of in and around the major joint of the heel and stuff. Especially when I used to jump in the cold. I don't know what it was, just the cold weather just didn't do well for me. And we started to play around with manipulation through there and gliding through the talus a little bit, and how that supported things. And it was like a click of feeling like something would happen, and this release of fluid into my joint, and I'd be like, right, I'm ready to go now. And it was instantaneous in terms of the way that it affected it. So there has to be a little bit of movement in there. And I do tend to, especially when I was coaching track and field athletes, I did used to just do, like before a major competition, just basic stuff. I'm definitely far from anyone that's within the rehab world, but just basic stuff.
Yeah, look, literally, when I say to clients, like, just get your hands on the bone and see does it move, and then just move it around a bit. It doesn't have to be fancy. And that's why I kind of asked about the stiffness question earlier, because I see coaches talking about joint stiffness and stuff like that. I'm like, do they actually believe that there should be zero movement here then? And I think maybe some people actually do, So how do you, when you say like some of your athletes, the amount of landings you're getting through, is that how you measure work done with them? Or are you measuring work done? Obviously you're counting landings. Is that the best way of doing it?
I always say this to coaches. In terms of the demographic that you work with, I think that you just have to go with this. If you're working with an individual, count their landings. If you're working with a group, count the distance in volume traveled. You have to know the movements when you do that though. Like you have to know like what 30 meters of hopping for distance is in comparison to 30 meters of bounding for height is. Like you have to build that knowledge into your programming and stuff. But when I work with a team of 15 basketball players, I'm not counting their landings. I don't want them to concentrate on counting. I'd much prefer them to just travel over a certain volume of distance. And you know what? It started to make me think a lot more about like why don't sprint coaches count the steps that they, that's my volume of measuring, because you've got a 20-year-old world-class athlete and a 15-year-old kid, and they're like, right, you're going to do 120s tonight, and you're like, wow, how much further did that 15-year-old kid run? How many more steps? It's made me think a little bit about that recently. But yeah, that tends to be the way that I'll measure things. It's just dependent on the cohort that I'm working with.
Yeah.
But if you're working with big groups, distance is your best friend.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Kind of not last question, but I want to know just maybe a little bit more practically, right? So say I am dealing with a client with Achilles issues, or just rehab in general, right? So someone has Achilles issues. There's two reasons I think it can go wrong a lot of the time. One, they never cleaned up the issue in the first place. So it could be the calcaneus, it could be the landing, probably a mixture of those things, maybe the upper body, and they just the physio, whoever, just prescribed, here, just do more calf raises, and that will feel good to an extent because I'm just getting some kind of stimulus through the area. And then two, so I see them like get back to plyometric type movement, and then it's like, okay, it's a bit better, but the issue that was there in the first place is still there, and I hit a wall, I can't progress. Second reason is when it comes to getting back into coaching speed in the movement, the cues then again are like, you're still focused on feel this, feel that, a top down kind of cue, squeeze this, squeeze that. And again, I don't know if that's going to work too well, especially from a physio's point of view. Like they're so used to proprioceptive type of cues and all of that stuff, and then coaching speed is reflexive in nature. What's a good place to start to introduce some plyometric type of stimulus? And then what's a good way to think about maybe progressing on? It doesn't have to be like super specific, but what would come to your mind if you're working with an athlete who maybe has a lot of injuries and you need to start to bring some of this stuff back in a safe way?
Yeah, the light tier movement is, I always preach a lot of light tier moves, especially. I've got a British guy that I've been working with. He's actually 45. And he still dunks a basketball. Like he primarily is just a dunker sort of thing, and he uses our plyometric programs. And I'd say over the last 6 months, he's just used light tier movements, and it's cleared up his Achilles issues dramatically. Just being able to build in a volume of that kind of work, but making sure ultimately that it's not just a simple linear focused motion. There's a lot of multi-directional work, and especially backwards work. And I really, really like the way that the foot loads the ankle in terms of backwards movement, because there is more of I get athletes to transition from the toes off of the heel. And it seems to have quite a good correlation with that. So I think that the progression then comes around just having that relationship with the athlete and understanding what brings about pain, especially. And yeah, there has to be a constant flow of communication as to being like, okay, well, we're just going to ramp up these abilities, especially if you're only moving bilaterally. We can do thousands of variations bilaterally. We can bring in a split stance, which is going to maybe load the front foot in a better way. Or we can focus on that back leg getting a better load because it's more up on the toe. Yep. You're getting a little bit of a reflexive action to it. So it's difficult. It really is difficult. And especially like volume of plyometric of training is terrible. That, like, tell me right now, how many landings should I do a week?
Yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah, no idea.
Right? And everyone has a rough idea how to make people stronger. Everyone has a rough idea about even speed. So it's the individual is the person that's going to be giving you the feedback that you need. And from a non-clinical perspective and from just a coaching head, I play so much with pain, especially within dynamic movement. Listening to yourself and Jake Turan saying about you can push a little bit into pain when you're doing like static stuff. I think when it comes to elastic movement, I think that you're playing with fire a little bit, just because of how fast that's happening. I'm not confident in what the after effect of that's like. We all know what it feels like to wake up the next morning after you've really messed with some tendons the next day because you've just done far too much of something that it did not like, and it aggravates it dramatically. So it's using the spectrum of movements, and I've actually found that to load something like an Achilles works really effectively in the deep tier movements as well. It takes away certain like postural loading for certain joints. So in certain positions, things like the Achilles are going to be loaded better, or you're structurally going to be holding yourself in a position where there's still some level of load towards the tendon, but it's not dramatically fast. So I'm not sure that was a great answer, but
no, that's okay. I'm going to ask you a question, and again, it is a depends answer, right? So you're going to write an Achilles. My first block of plyometric movements for my Achilles with me. Okay. We don't know how I'm going to respond to it. We're just going to try, and we're just going to like nudge me into it. So how many days a week would you think about it giving it first?
So I'm working with a guy that ruptured his Achilles in August, full rupture. So, and we're kind of at a stage now where he's been kind of jogging lightly, and we're bringing in pliers now, and 2 and a bit. And it sounds funny, but like 2 and like a bit sometimes is quite good to do like a half volume measure, or I just do deep tier movements on that day. But normally at least 2 or 3. For sure.
2 is a good start, I think.
Absolutely.
Because you have that like 3 days rest, that extra day's rest in between, it can be a big deal in the beginning.
With the 3rd day, what I tend to do is the 2.5 kind of thing is I'll break the 2 larger sessions will be furthest apart, and that middle one will be more about deep tier, more metabolic load, and being able to get more blood flow through things. So it would tend to be, if we're at a real basic starting point, you're probably playing with something like 7 or 8 movements, and you're realistically probably going to get, because you're using light tier movements at the beginning, and it's very extensive and rudimentary to start with, you're probably going to get 100, 150 landings. Cool. Over the first couple of weeks. Can you give me an example of some of those 7 to 8 movements? Doesn't have to be exact, but just off the top of your head. If you would definitely be using, initially you'd be using forward linear bilateral leaps. You'd definitely be using a split stance leap. I wouldn't exchange it straight away, just because there's a speed element to the exchange. So there's an unknown of, when I exchange, what does that front foot now have to deal with? And I wouldn't be touching unilateral plyos probably until verbal feedback of saying I've not had pain doing these movements for the first 3 to 4 weeks, especially. And you can be quite just simply progressive in terms of the volume that you're integrating. Week 3 or 4, I'm bringing in backwards bilateral movement. And at the same time, I'm probably week 2, I'm bringing in exchanging movements. I find that doing things laterally is quite unique as well, with how we use the foot, especially with how we sweep the foot and how that loads the Achilles, which is quite unique. So I do have quite a bit, and I'll do that in a split and a stagger stance and a normal bilateral stance as well. So I could be in a split. So a split, you would call that a split. Let me get this right. Split leap. A split leap where I go straight up and land, but I could go split leap and leap left a little bit and keep leaping to the left as I go, and then back to the right. Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And then
I'm a big fan of that frontal plane, that medial lateral as well, especially with Achilles and or actually any Achilles, shin. I had a guy recently put up a post with his sesamoid issues, and we were just doing like that kind of skater hop side to side. You would call it actually a skater bound side to side. Getting it. And you just see that, like, you see that eversion and inversion of the foot and the calcaneus. That does wonders for people.
Absolutely. Yeah. And then we'll start to integrate like real, and it's a really basic way to term it, but like kind of real burner movements where we're doing like super high volumes in we'll get to like week 5 where we're starting to think about, we're going to progress this a little bit more intensity, and we'll do things. I'll do things like circle leaps where we'll progress forward, but we'll be doing it in a small circle as we move forward. And you're looking at probably close to 100 landings in like a 10-meter length of travel. And we'll go both ways. And especially because we're doing a bit backwards and we're moving laterally and forward in one kind of sequence. Those sort of, that's the only way I can describe it. It's just highly extensive kind of, athlete walks away like, Jesus, that is, lower legs are being set on fire doing that sort of stuff. I think
that is phenomenal. I think when I have a son, hopefully I'll have a son someday, but I could do with my daughter as well. Like, I would get them in the gym, but if I could train them doing all of that stuff for years and years and years, they're gonna just.
Yeah, exactly. So and the worst one of all is doing that in a hop, in a single leg variation, and that will come in like week 9 or 10, where we're integrating more intense stuff and unilateral stuff in a more highly extensive manner.
Love it, man. Love it. That's awesome. So then just one last thing on that programming stuff. We talked about the split leap or the split exchange leap, like frontal plane or sagittal plane or whatever you're going to do. Can you give me a few more examples of what you might, if you were to choose 6 or 7 movements, what a session of that might look like? The deep tier.
The deep tier.
Sorry,
okay. Yeah. Sorry. So the deep tier, there's quite a few variations in terms of how you look at it. So you've got the different stances of leaps, and again in a deep tier, I'll still do that laterally. I'll still do it in a forward motion as well, and I'll use different cues as well to situate things. So when I'm being really quite harsh, I do things like a double dip and then take off in a split stance.
Like a little oscillation.
Little oscillation.
I like the double dip.
Double dip, we call them. The guys hate it, especially my old track group. They used to be like, no.
Yeah. So that's just like getting them to feel that like slight change of direction happening.
Exactly. And then you're stopping momentum, dropping back down, and then coming out of it. We'll do things like skater bounds, which I think are fantastic. And we'll do them on the spot as well as traveling forward. I like to use leaping in a slalom fashion forward in like a deep range, because I think it's nice in terms of the stabilization through like upper groin and stuff, adductors, we have a few variations of unilateral movements. I have 2 different hops. We have one's called a swan hop, which is in like a T position where you're moving on one leg, you drop down, pump up. So you
posted it the other day. That was the slouchy one.
The slouchy one is a slump bound.
Okay.
Or my coach.
You're like me with your names. It's just different. What it looks like, I just name it.
Exactly. It used to be called the ragdoll bound because it looks like a ragdoll in terms of height. So I use that one and I love that one. It's so good when I think about all the movements that I was introduced to when I was an athlete. And it almost be like 2 or 3 movements within a plyometric session are just completely new that Eric would just bring into the mix.
Yeah, that's unbelievable. That's so good. So you have very little need for like plyo boxes and hurdles and all of this stuff. You just move your body. Think of any amount of ways.
Zero. Nothing.
So good.
What I will always preach is freedom of movement. I cannot stand hurdles being in the way of people trying. watching a coach lay out hurdles in the worst fashion possible, and an athlete's like this, trying to get their feet in between. I'm like, if it destroys what happens on the ground, that's it. Just walk away. You're not getting what you want out of it. So, and it's the same with boxers. People are like, oh, do you use box jumps? No, I just jump into the air because it's the exact same principle. Do you need a hurdle to create a stimulus? No, I just build a relationship with an athlete where I can I can create a stimulus for you using a verbal cue. And freedom of movement is the biggest thing that they possess. Then it's something that they can take hold of and focus on the ground more than anything else.
Yeah, that's unreal. I absolutely love that. If people, especially in the rehab process, because, well, especially in any process, just movement, but like in the rehab process with people, you're typically dealing with people who've lost confidence, a little bit of confidence, either in a local tissue or in their body as a whole. They've just lost confidence, and you're not seeing that expression in movement. You're seeing tension. So that's so good, man. So good. Okay, I have a generic question, which is, you're on a desert island. You might have heard Jake's answer, which wasn't very good. Shout out to Jake. I can't remember who he brought. Maybe John Locke was one of them. You can bring 3 coaches, dead or alive, if you want.
Wow.
Who are you going to bring?
Who am I going to bring? I think Charlie Francis would probably be up there. It would be interesting to have him there. Do you know what's really biased is I'd love to be on there with my mentor Eric, and have him, someone like Charlie Francis, someone like Dan Pfaff, and for us then to discuss things and learn, and because I look at the relationship that we have, for myself and him being my mentor. We do so much together, and we have an email conversation. Like, we don't do much of this because he's not that technically minded, but we email back and forth probably 4 or 5, 6 times a week, and we've done so for the last 12 years.
Yeah.
So like the conversation that we have we're so integrated into how both of us think and stuff. So it's so, like, if I was to do something like that, it would definitely have to be with him. So it's quite biased towards that, but I think the way that he would then find things that we would learn, he'd be able to tell me more about it and how we can understand that as 2 people that work together. But yeah, I think Charlie Francis would be up there. I've spoken to Dan Pfaff a few times, and I just love some of his stuff. It's quite biased towards track and field, unfortunately.
Hey, it's your island, so whatever you want. That sounds pretty good to me. Not for Kashansky, no.
Oh yes, that. I'm sorry, Doctor. Yeah.
I'll leave you have one more. You can bring him as well.
I'd have to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I apologize.
Okay. You should run if you're ever back in the UK with Eric, if there was a little workshop or something like that, I'd definitely go. Yeah.
There's a few things in the. Yeah, we're putting a few things together, so there'll be lots more work that's coming out from him over the next few months.
Cool.
But yeah,
you need to get people like that their work out there, not to be morbid or anything like before, but like that work has to be there. Like, you don't want to lose that work for whatever reason. I know you're doing a good job with that. Where can people find you, or where would you like people to go to?
I'm most active on Instagram, just @McInnes Watson, and go to PLUSPLYOS if you want to know more about plyometrics. I've got links in my bio with quite a few articles that I've written for a few companies, a few courses that I've been part of, and just go to PLUSPLYOS. You'll find plenty of stuff on there. It's going to be continually kind of developing over the next few months. We're pretty new to things. We're only 2 years in, so it's an ever-growing thing. And reach out to me on social media. I love talking this stuff. Appreciate it.
Cool. Is the business going well?
Yeah,
the
really,
subscription
really well.
Stuff.
Yes, it's a subscription-based service, and it's educational as well as program-based, and it's going to be branching out a little bit. Eric's bringing some new stuff, a new term that he calls plyometrics. So it's going to be interesting. It's looking at isometrics and tension with movement, which is I think it's going to be a nice bridge between that sort of work and plyometrics and dynamic stuff. So the next few months, it's going to be interesting.
Cool. I'm looking forward to it. All right, man. Thank you very much.
Thanks ever so much. Cheers.